learning. And we have a little bit in the past, especially when we talked about the behavioral school of psychology, we've talked about a couple different kinds of learning already. Does anybody remember what they are, what we talked about? Classical conditioning is one, and that was also called passive learning, right? You guys remember that? Okay, so when we have classical conditioning or passive learning, what do we have? Basically, we had a stimulus. It could be conditioned or one more kind. Neutral, right? And then what did that give us? Some kind of response, yeah. Okay. So this is called passive learning because, like, did the dogs need to be told, or were they actively trying to respond? For example, when we think about Pavlov, they just did, right? It just happened. It's sort of classical conditioning, passive learning. But when we talk about higher order learning, right? So we're not talking about a straight reaction to a stimulus like we're talking about here. There's going to be a little bit more involved than that, right? I mean, we took all that time to learn the parts of the brain and what they do and all the lobes. So you sort of have to hope that those are going to come into play a little bit, right? So when we move into sort of higher order learning, what we add into this equation is what? Say we're thinking about you guys trying to learn anything. There's a stimulus, whatever that is. It could be, the stimulus could be me talking my lecture, okay? There's a response. What would the response be? Hopefully. What's that? Having the information, retaining the information. What could get added in the middle there? That's part of it. What's the bigger concept? You guys have it all, parts of it. That's good. But from me talking to information being retained, what am I leaving out of the equation literally? I'm leaving out you guys. I'm leaving out the organism, right? So just stimulus and just information, that's why I said you guys are all having parts of it, right? Because processing, attention, distractions, all that stuff is what can happen to people that can affect learning, right? So when we think about higher order learning, what we want to remember is that we've got stimulus, organism, which is us or the rats in the maze or the dogs in the box, right? Whoever we're teaching, and then response. Okay, so this is a higher learning. This is like cognitive social learning. This is the kind of learning that we are doing most of the time, right? It's not very common for us to do really simple, classically conditioned stuff in day-to-day life, right? What are we using in day-to-day life more? A lot of common sense, a lot of stuff from if we're going to be using stuff like, say we're going to school, because you guys all do, right? Where in your memory, where in your brain are you going to be getting information that you're using to go to school? What part of your long-term memory that we talked about? So we can break long-term memory down into two sections at first. What are they? Okay, and then which one of those is going to contain the information you need for school? Right, and then within the explicit, we've got two kinds. What are there? Semantic and episodic. Which one's more likely to have school information? Semantic. Episodic could, because you guys, it's your life history and you're currently in school, right? But semantic is where we hold like our facts and figures sort of thing. So, I mean, that could be both to some extent, right? But if we're talking about information, our encyclopedias, that's going to be semantic. Okay. So we are doing that all day long. We're drawing from our memories, whether they be semantic, episodic, whatever it is that we need to remember. We are making new memories, right? We are learning new things, and those are becoming new neural pathways in our brains. So all the time, pretty all day long, most of your life, you're doing this sort of cognitive social learning, right? Information is around you, and you're integrating it into your own psyche in one way or another. When would you not, what kind of stuff would you not integrate, say, in a day like today? What kind of stuff doesn't need to be there? And that's different for different people. Sure. You don't need to remember that drive. You don't need to remember that I wore a tan jacket today, right? So what happens with that information? In and then out, right? And where might that happen? Right, sensory memory is going to bring it in, and short-term memory is going to say, I don't need to know that, right? That's going to go right out the window. So that's happening all day long. And the organism, it's happening in that short-term or working memory. You're deciding what you're learning and what you're not, right? What you're going to remember and what you're not. So, what is learning? It's not just memorizing things, right? It's not just putting things into memory. It's a higher order concept than that. What does it mean to learn? Okay, understand. So it's going to be processed better, right? And to have an understanding would be similar to like that elaborative processing, elaborative rehearsal. What else? What's something that you've learned to do, a simple skill? Read, add, subtract. Great. So those things are a change, right? You couldn't read or couldn't add or subtract, and now you can if you learn them. Does that make sense, right? It wasn't there before, now it is. How long do those skills last? Yeah, so relatively permanent, right? When I say relatively permanent, what might cause learned skills to not be permanent, to not stay forever? Injury, you mean like some sort of brain injury? Okay, what else? Disability? Not using it for a long time, right? I know that I learned certain math and calculus and things like that I haven't used since then. I might, and I couldn't do now. I might be able to relearn it a little more quickly, right? We talked about maybe things are never fully lost, but it's certainly not a skill that I could actively use today. Okay, so the definition of learning that I want you guys to have is that it is a relatively permanent change, in behavior and mental processes resulting from practice or experience. So it's a relatively permanent change in behavior or mental processes resulting from practice or experience. Okay, so we know we can learn things by practicing them, right? It can be practicing like, if you play soccer, just going to practice, practicing that. It can be practice like studying, right? I don't know, playing your instrument, you're learning how to cook, whatever it is, right? The more we do it, the more we practice a skill, hopefully the better we get at it. But we have to remember that we are responding to things, either within ourselves or within the environment, that are leading us to this. In that way, when you talk about that stimulus organism response, what we talked about earlier, people can get distracted, right? Things like that. What else is going to affect the way we respond to a stimulus? Okay.
Environmental factors.
Sure. What's that?
Disability.
Yep. What about thinking outside a little bit? For example, I'm from New York, and coming down here, I see more than I'd ever seen anywhere on people's cars and occasionally in homes, some Confederate flags. So I have my own thoughts, feelings, behavior, all that stuff around that, for example. I might respond to that stimulus in a different way than somebody else, right? What about if we heard gunfire right now? How would some people respond versus how might other people respond? Who's gonna like run and hide and shut the door? Right, okay.
Out in the field somewhere, like
If so, that's situational, right? Like you're like, oh, somebody's hunting, or uh-oh, right? Like, but what about, you know, there's certain people in the room that maybe had military experience or combat experience, and might have a different reaction to that, and hopefully react well so the rest of us can follow along. But we're all gonna, you know, based on everything about us, we're gonna all respond slightly differently to different stimuli, right? I don't know, even stimuli like, you know, you guys know I hate, I'm terrified of snakes. So I respond that way, whereas my husband's cousin picks them up and thinks like they're, you know, so neat and is very gentle with them, but I could never respond that way, right? So we always have to take into consideration, and for each and all of you, you guys are all hopefully learning something by being in this class, by being in college, right? But every single one of you learns in a slightly different way, right? Some people learn better by hearing the lecture. Some people learn better by reading the textbook. Some people learn better if they study in the morning or in the evening. And besides that, some people have higher expectations of themselves, right? Some people are more motivated to get an A or a better grade than others, you know, depending on how you were raised, what values you've internalized. All those factors are going to come into play, right? So it's not just like the physical situation in and of itself, but it's everything about you. So that's what we have to remember when we think about learning, is really to keep that piece of the organism in there, in this case us. But what do scientists study a lot? Besides, what organisms do they study a lot? Rats, right? That's like the big thing. Okay, so how do we learn new things?
Try new things.
What's that?
Try new things.
You try them and then practice, right? How do we learn new stuff? Teachers talking, lectures, things like that. What else? Yeah, videos, observation, right? What's that? Mistakes. I learned a lot of stuff by watching YouTube. Jesse? Repetition, absolutely, right? What else? How'd you learn how to ride your bike?
Repetition, just try and remember.
Persistence, right? Crashing a lot, probably. How do you learn in gym class? How did you learn how to do like jumping jacks and sit-ups and stuff like that? Well, you watch somebody else do it, right? What did you say? Examples, right? Or what we watch people do it. So there's a lot of observation in learning, right? But we're also taking, again, into consideration us, the learner. So along those lines, the first sort of type of learning that I want to talk about is insight learning. What does it mean to, what is an insight? Okay, an idea of what's going on. Okay, like you're being insightful, you have like a deeper understanding. What else? What else do you think of when you hear insight? What kind of process is it? Internal, cognitive, right? Okay. So we know that, obviously, as humans with brains that we use, hopefully, to think, that we've got a lot of things going on in our cognitive processes, right? So there was a German psychologist, early 20th century, like 1915, who was very interested in studying how big of a role cognitive factors played in our behaviors and our mental processes. When you think about that time in psychology, early 1900s, what's going on in psychology around the world? Where are we? Yep.
Sure.
So when we talked in chapter 1 about early psychologists and early psychological schools and things like that, what was happening in the early 1900s? What's that? He was a little later. I think even earlier. What were some of the early schools of psychological thought? Even earlier. How about structuralism, functionalism, that sort of stuff? What was happening specifically in the US? Who brought over, like, sort of the concept of psychology, I guess?
Was it, one?
He was in German. He came up with, what? What was one famous for? Father of psychology. What methods did he use? And how did he get his patients to tell him what was going on in their heads? Question. And what was that called? Introspection, right? So that stuff's all like late 1800s, and then we've got Titchener, and we've got, who else brings psychology over to the US? It's a very boring name. James. Right? Okay, so William James. So that's where it's happening right now, in sort of right then in sort of the field of psychology. So we're becoming very interested in these cognitive processes, right? And we'll definitely want to touch up on those early psychology things for the midterm. Okay. So we're very interested in what's happening in the human brain. So Kohler is also interested in what's happening in the human brain and how these cognitive things are sort of happening, because he understands, as do most people, that learning is a more complex process than we look at it in a sort of Pavlov's dog sort of framework, right? Especially with humans, but not just. So he wants to know what's leading to these complex behaviors that we're able to learn. Now, I know we talked about the other day, what animal are we most genetically similar to? Pigs. What animal are we both psychologically or cognitively similar to? Monkeys, right? So Kohler uses chimps. They're super smart and very similar to humans in their thinking. He wants to study them to see how they learn the more complex behaviors that they know. So what he does is gets a bunch of chimps, and he has a big cage, and at the top of the cage he hangs bananas, which is a food that they enjoy, right? And he hangs the bananas low enough that the chimps can just reach up and help themselves to a banana. Simple enough. Then what he does is he raises the height of the bananas, so now they're sort of just out of reach. They're just out of reach, so what are the chimps going to do? Jump. So it doesn't take them very long to figure that out. But that is a learned behavior, right? So they see that, they can do that, they jump, they get the bananas. Then he raises the bananas higher so that even the best jumping chimps can't get them. All right, so they're jumping for a while, that's not working. Then he puts into the cage or enclosure with them, he puts like wooden crates, like milk crates, things to stand on, sticks, different lengths of sticks and things like that. And he finds that in a not very long amount of time, what do the chimps figure out to do? They climb up on the stick, they climb up on the crates, right, where they use the sticks, and then the bananas go higher and higher, and now they're stacking the crates on top of each other. I mean, they've really got this sort of figured out. And what he noticed is once they figured out this tool idea to either use the stick or the crate, after that, and that took some frustration, a lot of jumping, like I said, right, because they don't know what to do at first, so they keep trying what they thought they knew. Then all of a sudden they sort of figure it out. After they figure out the first thing, after one of them figures out, oh, I can climb on this crate and get up there, how fast do you think the rest of it happened? Very quickly, right? Once they had that insight, the rest of it came very quickly. So when we're talking about insight learning, that's what we're talking about. And the definition of insight in that case is a sudden understanding, right? So it's like a out of the blue, eureka moment, light bulb goes off, a sudden understanding of a problem that implies the solution. Right? So it's just happens instantly. It's not something that they are building up to. So it's opposite then sort of from the kind of learning we're doing here, right? We talk about basic stuff, and then we add concepts, and then we add material, right? We're sort of building up to a general base knowledge of psychology. So that's not insight learning. But within this framework, you could certainly have moments of insight learning. Maybe for this class, maybe for others, but has everyone had a moment when they all of a sudden realized, oh, I get it now, or this is the answer, or this is, the problem, this is the solution. And it can certainly come in an educational, academic setting, but anywhere in life. Like you're learning how to drive stick with the car, and all of a sudden, you figure it out, and then after that, it's a lot easier. So stuff like that in general, right? That would be insight learning. It's literally like the idea of, that light bulb going off and you got it. So an insight is something that goes off between the presentation of the problem, in Kohler's example would be getting the bananas, and using the solution, solving the problem. In between those two things, there's going to be sort of that eureka moment that gives you an insight. In this kind of learning, right? That doesn't always happen. Any questions on that and the idea of insight or insight learning? Okay. Another kind of learning I want to talk about is called latent learning. When have we used that term, latent? Does anybody remember? Dreams? Yep. And what did it mean? Was it the obvious? It's the underlying, the hidden concept, right? We talked about Freud and dream analysis, and there's two kinds of content that we use in dreams for dream analysis. One was latent. Anybody remember the other one? Yep, manifest. Manifest content is the obvious content. So that's the part of the dream that you say, like where you were and what you did and all that sort of stuff, right? And then there's the latent content. That's the part that Freud would try to analyze to see what was going on in our unconscious or our psyche. So Freud used that, and what kind of psychology was Freud doing? Yeah, psychoanalytic. Later on, they called it psychodynamic, right? And is that one of the modern schools of psychology? Yep. Good. All right. Just keeping a little bit of review in here too, right? Okay, so latent learning is what then? If latent means hidden content, what is latent learning going to be? Yeah, both of those, right? You said subliminal, and you said things you pick up you don't realize. How many of you, this for me happens all the time, but I watch like a show or a movie or something, and I realize either that I know something, some clue or something that they've said or a place they've been, or I use that information later because I've learned something from a movie, like a random fact or something, that later on I know, and I don't really know how it got there, right? There's things like this all the time. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's bad, because you may be learning things incorrectly from television and movies and things like that, right? So we have to be careful with that. That would be an example of what kind of concept that we talked about in memory. If you get information from a bad source. Misinformation, yep. We talked about the sleeper effect. What about source amnesia? What did that mean?
It means you remember it from before, but now it's so long distance you might actually.
You might think it's true, right? You don't know where you got it from. It could have been a terrible fact from a terrible source, right? It could have been Donald Trump stating things on policy that absolutely untrue, and maybe in 10 years you remember that, but you forgot where it came from, right? So you can't remember if you need to throw it out or not. Misinformation, sleeper, source amnesia, right? Those are all different kinds of ways that we forget things or remember things incorrectly.
Could another example of latent learning be like picking up traits from other people, or like
Give an example, if you could.
like how I have a friend and
Okay. On the surface, I would call that more observational learning, which is actually one that we're going to talk about. But if there's something that's sort of taken to play, the reason that you started mimicking or using some of her techniques is because you found that they maybe were more effective, like if you're like, oh, she gets uptight and she does this and that, and then you're like, oh, but like this got done, right? This worked. That could be an example of insight. So you realized that this approach was a better approach or a more effective approach. That would be insight. If it wasn't that, and it was just that, as we do when we work closely with people, we start to pick up other people's traits and things, that would be more observational learning. And it's probably a combination of both because we are complex creatures, right? So yeah, there could be a couple things going on in there. So, and then, with latent learning, that's just it. So, do you guys, and you see this a lot in kids, like they'll randomly come up with some statement or fact and you have no idea, like, where they got it. My niece the other day, I said something and she's like, oh, that's alliteration. She's 6, right? So I didn't think she really was going to know what alliteration was. But she was right. She picked it up because her mom is a tutor and she's a reading specialist. So just by, being around once in a while different things, she knows what alliteration is. But if I'd asked her outright, like, what grammar rules did she know, she might not have been able to come up with that, right? So that's the learning that's happening that we don't really realize. What kind of situations, besides watching TV where we really do some latent learning, what other ways do we do that, do you think?
Reading.
What's that? Reading? Okay. It's getting in there, right? But you're not like consciously. Random facts, absolutely. What about, Jack said earlier about driving to class, right? Think about all the times we drive places and just knowing how to get around in like Wilmington or Castlehane or wherever you are. That's all sort of latent learning. It's all in there. Like, turn left here and go here, and maybe a general sense of direction or where things are. That's all. Like, it's not in your conscious processes all the time unless you're using it, but it's all this sort of cognitive mapping, really, that's taken place. That's just there when you need it. Okay. Does that make sense? We've got knowledge, but unless we have reason to use it, it doesn't come out. That's basically what it is. Okay, and then we brought up just now the idea of observational learning as well, right? So observational learning is something that we also all do all the time. Pretty straightforward. What do you think it is?
When you see somebody else do something, you copy.
Yeah, learning by watching others, right? Watching or imitating others. We can learn new behaviors or new information. So from an evolutionary standpoint, because everything has to be, right? What we do is for some reason, you'd hope. What would be the purpose of observational learning? Chasing a woolly mammoth? Right. So don't do that, right? Cliffs are to be avoided. Right, or these certain berries are poisonous, right? I saw somebody get really sick and die, so I'm not going to eat those purple berries. So really is survival like that, right? Avoiding dangerous stimulations or stimuli. So that's a good basic form of it, right? And then what about now in more modern society? Dancing. What are some of the functions? But there's a lot of things we can and learn better by observational, right? Why do we continue to, now that we're so developed and we have our nice big frontal lobes that have all sorts of good information in them, why do we still need to use observational learning? What's the function that it still might have? You brought up dancing, right? Right. Certain concepts can only be taught or understood or processed by observing. What dancing, I mean, certainly you could read a book on dancing that says pick your left foot up and move it, forward 5 inches and to the left 6 inches. Right. That's and what will that still be missing? Even if it described in detail every movement that you had to do, what makes you a better dancer or not? Right. So can you read that? No. Okay. What else can you only or primarily get by observing?
A lot of technology based.
A lot of technology-based stuff, sure. And that's why, like, it seems like the younger the kids are, the better they are at it, right? What else? What do we do? Music. What do we do all day long? Unless we aren't interacting with anyone, what do we do all day long that we don't probably even think about? Huh? Talk.
Observing. You're looking around at other people.
What are all those examples of? Interactions, perhaps, right? Yeah. I don't know. It's an interaction, for sure, right? What, if you guys are looking at me and I go, ugh, what am I feeling? Annoyed, tired, frustrated. What else? What other cues can we pick up from people? Don't bother me. Arms crossed. I guess I'm really not in a good place up here. Mad, right? What about happy? Happy to see you. Joyful. You can make eye contact with people. Little subtle cues, right? Like all those things. How do we learn those? By observing people, right? All these body language, facial expressions, and that has a lot to do with how we get by in day-to-day life, right? You can say hello to someone and greet them in so many different ways, with the body language, with the tone, with the facial expressions, that you could be more angry than you've ever been with anyone before and say hello, or so excited to see somebody, you know, and just thrilled that they're there, somebody you really love, and say hello. And even though you're saying the same word, right, you're telling a much different story with different observable factors, which we know, right? Okay. So a lot of observational learning tells us a lot about social learning and social interactions and how to sort of get by in society, right? If you're standing online at the DMV and the person in front of you is being really rude with the worker, right? And then they leave and you get up there, what might you do?
Being really, really, really nice.
And even as you're stepping up, what is your face gonna look like? Happy, put a smile on. Hey, how are you? You know, whatever it is, to try to get that person to feel happy, or at least not be so angry that they like take it out on you, right? So there's a lot of things that we're gonna do, and facial expressions are one. But again, like body language, crossing your arms, all that sort of stuff. And in modern society, if we want survival, and this could be modern society or it could be thousands of years ago, what's their best chance for survival? Survival in is it easier to be on your own or in groups or numbers?
Groups.
Right. Okay. So if you want to be in a group, what do you need to be able to do? Work together, tolerate, not get kicked out, right? All those things are essential to survival. So these observational learning things are still, you know, now maybe we all know to run away from tigers or things like that, but observational learning is still a big part of society and how we can function in society, right? Now, that being said, if you were a human and you'd never seen a tiger before, never seen one on TV, and then you saw one, would you know to run away? No. So we're still learning observationally, right? We watched enough Animal Planet or Discovery Channel or something to know what we need to do in some of those situations, right? Okay. So this observational learning theory comes about a big topic in our current society. What is it that we are constantly talking about? What's a big issue with some sort of observational learning? When you watch the news at night, what kind of stories do you hear? Someone being shot, gun violence, okay? What do a lot of people say when we have an incident of gun violence? Who do they sometimes blame? Yeah. Even before, well, I guess they always sort of did, but what else? What might that get blamed on?
Mental illnesses.
Mental illnesses? What else?
Police.
What else? Who plays video games
Oh.
in here? Or watches action movies or guns on TV, violence on TV, war stuff, right? It's pretty common to say many people want to blame television, movies, video games for violence, right? They say that kids watch too much of it, they become desensitized to it, and then what do? Right? Or they think it's not real. So shooting somebody in a video game, to certainly a younger child too, is no different than shooting someone for real, right? It's all sort of make-believe, all sort of part of that. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that watching violence could incite violence? Who thinks yes? I'm not saying maybe call it like a school shooting or something, but does watching violent behavior somehow cause people to behave, or not cause, be highly correlated with people behaving more violently? Who says yes? Okay, so there's numerous studies on this. Now, I just messed up because I said, does watching violent stuff cause violence, right? Why can't I say that?
Because it's not directly correlated.
Right. I can't prove it because it's not, a correlation only means a relationship, right? Because I haven't run an appropriate scientific experiment that say this television and only this television is what caused these people to be violent, right? Because what's the only kind of study that can state causation? Good. What kind of aspects make up an experimental study? What do we have? What are some of the things? Just shout them out.
Dependent variable.
Independent and dependent variable. Good. What else makes up an experimental study? Control groups, random assignment, right? Double blind. What about a correlational study? What does correlation say?
That could.
One person does this, and the outcome does.
It shows a relationship, right? That smoking and lung cancer, right, or, for example, are highly correlated. But we cannot say it's the only cause, right? So it's not causation. So correlation never implies causation. If you have a correlational study and they tell you that the variables have an R of 0.9, what kind of relationship is that? Strong. And is it positive or negative? So what does that mean about the variables? What does that tell you that it's a positive relationship?
They're going in the same direction.
Right, they're going in the same direction. So either as one goes up, the other goes up, or as one goes down, the other goes down. What if I said negative 0.3 was your correlation coefficient? Yep, week one going in opposite directions. Good. Okay, so sorry, back to the observational learning. So there's been a lot of studies on this because it's especially in more modern times where we have television and social media and sort of constant access to that sort of thing. The idea that watching or being exposed to violence can lead people to act more violently. But we started studying this, when did TV come out? 50s, 60s? And so we've been looking at it for some time. So there's a guy named Albert Bandura, and he does a study with do you guys know what a Bobo doll is? They're usually clowns, actually, which is particularly creepy. Yeah, you punch it down and it pops back up. They have like a weight in the bottom. So they're like those soft blow-up things, and you can hit them and they kind of wobble back and forth. So Bandura decides to run this study. So he gets a couple different groups of kids because he needs controls and experimentals, right? In one group, the kids are just in a room together and they watch on TV a group of children, and those kids have the Bobo dolls and they're playing with them, so they're punching them down and coming back up, right? In another section, the kids are watching on TV kids with Bobo dolls, but they're just ignoring them. They're sort of on the, at recess, whatever, but they're not interacting with the dolls at all. No punching, no violent behavior. And then a third room, the kids are watching an actual group of children. So it'd be like if we were up here and I'm watching you guys play with the dolls. And when I say play, I mean hit and kick and, knock them down, because that's sort of the play. And what he found was that in any instance where the children observed the more violent behavior, so whether they watched it on TV or saw it in real life, when those children then were put in a room with the Bobo dolls, what do you think they did? The same thing. They punched and kicked and did whatever. And the children that were observing the nonviolent, or sort of ignoring or nonviolent behavior, what did they do? They did, right? Now, obviously, this is not, there's a lot of factors that go into this, as we talked about, right? This is not a black and white study, but it was the beginning of the idea that this observational learning can come not just from real life, right? So think about when TV first started, a lot of it was what? Very censored, and it was stuff that you saw in real life because there wasn't a lot of special effects, right? Drama, world politics, right? We didn't, know what was going on with ISIS and Syria and see bombing victims and shootings and everything like that from all around the world. So we were watching, what do they have? Leave It to Beaver, right? Family shows or music. What was that? Yeah, I Love Lucy. So shows that, in theory, other than the I Dream of Jeannie or something, but that came later. In theory, shows that were really could have happened in real life. They watched, The Tonight Show had bands on, right? And it spoke to guests. You could have been watching a live performance or not. But obviously, the more advanced everything's gotten over the years, and with these special effects and these sort of crazy plot lines and things that we can do with these blockbuster movies, but also on TV shows and everything like that, there's a lot more access to, and people have become more, inundated with this sort of constant barrage of information, right? Information and violence. What kind of stuff do you watch? Who watches TV at least every day? At least some TV every day. It could be like you just even have the news on in the morning or whatever. Who watches TV less than like 5 days a week? And you guys are doing what with your free time? Studying, working. Okay, normal stuff, right? For those of you that don't watch much TV, are you still sort of, do you look at your phone, do you look at Yahoo, or sort of updates on what's going on in the world around you, right? So for most of us on any given day, we're gonna know what kind of information comes through. Horrifying stuff for sure.
Seasonal, like this October, there's obviously going to be more advertisements for like Halloween.
Yep, a lot of the advertisements telling us what we should be doing with our time and money, right? What else comes through? A lot of celebrity information, right? Somebody gained weight, somebody got a divorce, all that stuff. Somebody wore this outfit and looked awesome or horrible. All that stuff gets in there. What else? What else do you see or hear? Food. I like food too. I pay attention to all the food stuff. So when we're doing this, when this information is coming at us, what is it actually doing to us? Are we learning things when we see this stuff? Yeah. So what is it doing if we're learning it? What is it doing to our brains? Filling up space, but it's doing it by changing what's in there, sort of, right? So when we learn something or information comes into our brains, we know that we have pathways that are being changed. Maybe it's replacing old information that we thought we knew, right? So all this media that we expose ourselves to, or we are exposed to, or our children or younger brothers and sisters or nieces and nephews are exposed to, is changing us, right? And that's something that I think it's important to keep in mind. Every time we see something or hear something or learn something new, we have like a slight change. We talked about our brains having that neuroplasticity or neurogenesis, right? That ability to absorb and change and move on. So I think it's interesting, but it's also a bit of a cautionary tale to make sure, or to think about what you're exposing yourself to, right? Along those lines, we're not going to have time to do it in class, so this is going to be a brief homework. I want you to write me a short essay, like half a page, paragraph more so, on whether or not young children, I say children under 5, should be allowed to watch TV. Sort of why or why not. It doesn't have to be a yes or no, it can be in moderation. You know, it's your response to that based on what we talked about today about how we learn different things.
I just thought about Mean Girls.
She's got the jungle, like she's remembering how people did things in Africa.
No, not only that, but she went over to the popular girl's house and her little sister was watching TV.
Oh,
Like,
what
girls
girl
on
was
fire,
that?
and she was like raising up.
Yep, yep.
So should our children watch violent TV? Is that-
Any TV at all, really. Violent certainly can come into that. You know, you could argue, for example, that some educational cartoons were okay, but maybe you don't agree with violent shows, or you know. So it's really, guys, it's just your opinion, and it doesn't have to be like always yes or always no.
Children under 5.
Yeah, under 5. You know, young children.